Hello and welcome to Fireside Fantasy and Sci-Fi, episode 34.
34?
Yeah, there's no Stephen King reference to 34.
I know, right?
At least not one that I know of yet. This episode, we're going to be doing... There will be spoilers in this episode because we're going to be reviewing short stories that have a connection to the Dark Tower series. So obviously, there's going to be spoilers for those short stories, as well as all the books up to the final book of the Dark Tower. We're going to be talking about Everything's Eventual, Low Men.
Eventual.
Oh yeah, that's right. Low Men in Yellow Coats from
Hearts in Atlantis.
Hearts in Atlantis, and then the Little Sisters of Eluria, which
is from Everything's Eventual.
Oh, is it? They're in the same one?
Yeah, they're in the same book.
Okay.
They're actually back-to-back, Little Sisters of Eluria, and then the next story is Everything's Eventual.
Okay, gotcha. So I've not read the last book of the Dark Tower series. People that listen to the podcast kind of know this dynamic, but in case if this is your first episode, you've read everything several times, big Dark Tower fan. I'm a noob to this universe, but we're on the last book, so I feel like I'm like really baptized.
You're almost there,
point.
Man.
Yeah, I know. I'm excited. We're reading the last book now. In the second chapter, the chapters are really parts, but I'm in the second chapter, and it's. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, it's like the journey coming to an end, but then you get like these little things that you can always revisit, and then there's still other Dark Tower short stories that I would like for us to read. And then there's also the Wind Through the Keyhole, 0.5 book, which we could always go back and do too, because it's always like cool to like fall back into that world, and you're like, oh yeah, I miss these guys, kind of thing.
I'm kind of sad that we're at the conclusion, but at the same time, I'm wondering how this is gonna. Like I was expecting we've already read, we still have a lot to go, but from what I've already read of the last book, I was kind of expecting things to get more topsy-turvy, but at this point, it's basically been all setting up. But we'll probably
setting up for the topsy-turvy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll do a catch-up episode on what we've read so far in the Dark Tower, maybe next episode or the one after, so stay tuned for that, but I guess we won't spend too much time talking about it now. So, the Little Sisters of Eluria. So this short story, I've pulled the synopsis from Wikipedia, and I'm going to do my best to read this.
And essentially this takes place right before the gunslinger, so it's before he meets Walter and starts on his journey, but he's already on the journey. It's just before we pick it up, right before it.
In the last episode, I said something about, he's got the same mule that he has at the beginning of the Gunslinger. That was wrong because that mule dies right. All right, I must not have read. Yeah, I hadn't read that far yet, but he dies right away. So the Little Sisters of Eluria. The tale features Roland of Gilead, whose quest for the Dark Tower is in its infancy. Its events precede those of the body of the Dark Tower cycle, but occur after Roland's experiences in Magus. As chronicled in The Dark Tower for Wizard Glass, at the time of telling, he is accompanied by a horse and is already following Walter O'Dim, the Man in Black. He plans to eventually buy another horse or perhaps a mule, which ties in with the events of the beginning of the Dark Tower, the Gunslinger. So I know it had some kind of connection. So I guess maybe whatever he dies in this book, but then he buys the mule at the beginning of the Gunslinger. Roland and his horse arrive at the deserted village where they encounter a feral dog bearing a cross-shaped spot in its fur, attempting to eat a dead body. Roland scares it off, and while looking over the corpse, finds a rectangular medallion, takes it, and is immediately attacked and rendered unconscious by a group of slow mutants. He later awakens in a hospital marquee run by a strange group of nuns, calling themselves the Little Sisters. They use tiny bug-like creatures they call doctors to heal his severe injuries. Roland slowly discovers the sisters are actually vampires who bring stray survivors back to their hospital, only to feed on them once they've recovered. So the sisters kind of reminded me of the sisters in the most recent Resident Evil game. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
I haven't played, but I know I'm assuming you're talking about the big, tall, like...
Yeah, but she also has sisters that are her like minions in the games, 4 or 5 of them. And they're like these like, attractive women that are, this zombie-esque and disfigured, but they turn into like bats and bugs and all this stuff. So that's why it reminds me of this a good bit. The medallion Roland took from the dead body in the village proves to be a sort of holy protection from them. He notices another patient next to him who bears a matching medallion, and Roland comes to learn that the dead man whose medallion he removed is the brother of his fellow patient. Roland's wounds are eventually healed, but he is powerless to escape from his malevolent benefactors, who keep him weakened with potions. One of the sisters, Sister Gina, reveals to Roland that she had involuntarily joined the other sisters and longs to leave them. She sneaks a dose of a powerful herb to Roland, which counteracts the weakening potions, and he slowly regains his strength until they are ready to escape. So I had a thought reading this part of the story. Roland is like a ladies' man. Like,
oh yeah, I mean,
he's always intoxicating some woman somewhere.
Well, he's got that rugged.
I mean,
like,
well, how many men have come through this hospital that Roland's the one? Where was I at? The sister brings one of the mutants to the hospital to remove the medallion from Roland and the patient next to him. Since the sisters are unable to touch the medallions themselves, they were using one of the slow mutants to touch the medallion since they couldn't.
Right.
The mutant realizes the sisters will most likely kill him after he has removed the medallion, so he removes the medallion from the patient next to Roland and slashes the patient's neck open. The sight of gushing blood incites the sisters into a feeding frenzy, allowing the mutant to escape and Roland to retain his medallion. The next night, and Sister Gina initiate their escape, but the other sisters try to stop them. Sister Gina reveals an ability to command the doctors who provide a diversion. Their leader, Great Sister Mary, soon catches up with them, but is attacked and killed by the same cross-bearing dog Roland first encountered. Roland and Sister Gina declare love for each other, but Gina disintegrates into what may have been her natural state, the tiny doctors, while Roland is asleep. Roland allows himself a moment of sorrow before his quest for Walter and ultimately the tower continues once again quite alone. So that is the synopsis of The Little Sisters of Eluria.
Right.
I thought this was cool to get like this little peek of Roland before the gunslinger, but it's also helpful if you've read, the gunslinger and a bit of the Dark Tower before you read this.
And it throws you a little. I mean, obviously, this would just be like if you never read the Dark Tower, it would just be like a little story about vampires and a guy. But like in this, they did throw in like some throwbacks to the tower. Like, he mentions that this is the first female that actually stirred some sort of emotion since Susan had died.
Yeah.
And then like when he first kind of wakens up, the very first time when he's in the sling thing and he looks up and he sees the sisters, he thinks they're Rhea of the Coos. And like,
Yeah,
so it's kind
yeah.
of some really cool little throwbacks
Yeah.
to the story and stuff like that.
In Glass, he says that he sees Rhea again later on
Yeah, he
in
does.
his journey. So I was thinking she was going to come into the story, but yeah, that was interesting.
But yeah, there's, I mean, like, so a couple things. One, the slow mutants. So
Yeah,
I feel like in this world that there's like, kind of like where vampires, you have type 1, type 2, and type 3. I feel like there's different versions of slow mutants because like the slow mutants that we've seen previously, like from the gunslinger when they're under the mountain, they just seem like mindless zombies.
Yeah.
In this one, they still had like a conscience of some sort. If he does what the sisters tell him to do, he's going to die. So, you know, he takes the medallion, kills the guy, and escapes. And then, like at the beginning, they're kind of hesitant to approach him. Like he's got a gun, and like he's shooting them at their feet and stuff like that. And it's like maybe it's a thing where over time you just slowly lose your consciousness, whatever, and eventually they will be something like that.
Or even it even could be something Roland doesn't understand. Like that these people are what he calls slow mutants, and then he sees the people under the mountain. They could be something else, but from Roland's perspective, they're so similar to one another, he calls them the same thing,
Right. Oh. That's just a general term for anything wacky. And I did notice one thing, too, is another cool thing, and I don't know if it directly has a correlation, but there's a part where, what's her name? Sister Mary or Maria? Sister Mary, who's the head.
Mary's the head one.
She says something like, go over there and do something to that pube. And that's kind of like, they were calling the people in Lud.
Oh, yeah,
the pubes
that's right.
And the grays.
Yeah, in Lud.
And I was like, that's kind of interesting.
I forgot about
I never caught that before either. So that may be another
it really hasn't come up
term.
again. Yeah, since the town of Lud, that really hasn't come up much again since then. Huh.
So, I mean, but I think it's very interesting take. Now, one thing that another kind of thing parallel that's not part of this is when Jenna dissolves and she, basically bug form. I kept thinking of Brandon Sanderson and the, what are those creatures called again? The little
forget
bug
what they're
dudes.
called, but
I was like, heck yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's one of my favorite things about the novellas.
Yeah.
So I thought this was a cool short story. I liked getting a little bit of Roland side quest action. And the stuff you're talking about that kind of ties into like Lud and the rest of the Dark Tower series. Was there anything in the Little Sisters of Eluria that is sort of a glimpse into the final book or into what's to come? Or is it more... When did this come out, by the way? Did this come out between basically where we are, like between Song of Susanna and the Dark Tower? Or it had to come after Wizard and Glass.
Yeah.
But I don't...
Let's see. Copyright 2002. So
it's 2002. So let's look up the Dark Tower.
Yeah, I don't have the Dark Tower book handy, but I know. I would say this would have come out before the Dark Tower.
2004.
Yeah, so I think Hearts in Atlantis and this probably came out before. I don't have a physical copy of Hearts in Atlantis, so I think.
And then Song of Susanna is
like 2001.
Had to be. This says copyright 2004, but that must not be.
I mean, it could
This couldn't have come out in 2004. Huh.
Well,
I'm thinking about the World Trade Center thing.
Yeah.
Or the Wolves of Kala, too. I forgot about that one.
Yeah, the last three books came out really fast after he recovered from his wreck or being hit. All within like a year or so of each other. But yeah, I would say
So-
also, what is it?
So, so The Wizard in Glass came out in 97. And then it wasn't until 2003 that Wolves of the Kala came out. So this short story, you said 2001, was published between Wizard and Glass and Wolves of the Kala.
Okay.
Which I'm surprised that Song of Susanna came out in 2004, because I assumed that whenever Stephen King chose the World Trade Center as the place for them to hide the Black 13, I thought it was sheer coincidence. I didn't think it was, Stephen King, lived through 9/11, so he knows that this will happen and he's using it in his story. I thought it was sheer coincidence that he said the World Trade Center, he wrote the book in 2000, and then 2001, 9/11 happens.
Right.
That's
so,
what I thought. But apparently, no, it was after.
Yeah. So he specifically put Black 13 there, but as far as out of character, knowing that the World Trade Center would be destroyed and it would collapse on Black 13.
Yeah.
So now Hearts in Atlantis.
Yeah, I thought it was coincidence. But yeah.
September 28th, 2001. So it was right after 9/11.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, interesting. Is there anything else to touch on the Sisters of Eluria? Or
I like the fact that, it's another kind of re-imaging of vampires.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And so, you have all these other different types of vampires.
Which it's another thing that is similar to the Resident Evil. I wonder if there's some influence on whoever it was that designed those characters for the Resident Evil, because that is another thing, is they're vampire-like. It's very, very similar.
So here's my question too.
Yeah.
Because this one,
I was just going to say, I like the theme of these, it's like a vampire hospital. So they're, it's like they're bringing people in that are injured. They're keeping them alive, but not strong enough to escape. And so you might end up in this hospital and think, oh, thank God. But then there's this dark twist to it where it's oh, they're only keeping me alive so that they can feed off of my blood.
Feed off of me, yes. I like the little bells, the twinkling thing. They shake their head and control the little bugs and all that stuff. That's kind of cool thing.
Yeah.
So the ending. So we talked about how Roland, this is the first Jenna or first female that he's kind of stirred feelings for, and then of course she dissipates or whatever you want to call it, and then the ending there, it says Roland allows himself a moment of sorrow before his quest for Walter, and ultimately Tower continues once again quite alone. But let's say that all things aside, Jenna was normal. I still
not a
feel
vampire bug lady.
Yeah, there's no way though. Roland is obviously not let anything stand in his way of the Dark Tower.
Yeah.
So even if she didn't dissipate, if she was normal, he was not going to be with her. Kind of like one of those pipe dreams I think he had in his head. And if she wouldn't have been this, something else would have happened to her. He would have left her. He would have somehow killed her in some weird way, or maybe not on purpose, but there was no way, regardless, that this relationship was going anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, how much? I don't remember how much the story implies that Roland is head over heels for her. He does say that she's the first woman that he's been interested in since
Susan. And stuff, which is also kind of
yeah. I forgot about
strange.
I forgot about that a little bit.
It was more of lust and not really a love. He saw a sexy chick and he hadn't had sex in a while.
Yeah,
and it just happened to be a lady made of bugs.
Yeah, as a story age as old as time.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking you're right though. So you're changing my perspective on it, but my original thought was she was just a means to escape, and you know, he could have been attracted to her, but really he was just trying to use this as an opportunity to escape. She's willing to help him out of the situation. He's not going to stop at anything to get to the Dark Tower, so it was a means to get out. But you are right. The hair thing and the bells, and he was definitely infatuated with her more than just that. So I don't know. But then whenever we read the rest of the story, which obviously we know that this wasn't written at the time, so we kind of have to give some forgiveness there. But just thinking about it in continuity, that we are introduced to never mentions this character. He only talks about Susan, and he's even right after this, whenever he's with the lady at the bar. Yeah, I can't remember her name, but he's even thinking about Susan Delgado even in those moments. So, yeah, I think it's probably a similar situation to that lady, because I forgot he had a fling with her too. Roland doesn't go to a town without, like, he doesn't, whenever he shows up in these little towns, he doesn't sleep alone. You know, like Roland is a killer.
Rosita.
Yeah.
Like, he's a ladies' man.
He is. I'm hoping that the book ends, which obviously you've read it and I've not, but I'm hoping the book ends with going back to the Kala and just living out the rest of his days quietly with Rosita.
With a serape and a...
Getting rubbed down with her fancy lotions or whatever it was that she's got.
The cat gut. It stinks, but it's effective.
Well, I liked it as a short story. It's a cool one. These other two short stories, I feel like, are more that there's more clues there that I should pick up on that will tie into the ending, you know, with the breakers and the low men and all of this. Let's do Everything Eventual first, which was, I think, out of all three, if I put them in order as what were my favorites? My favorite was Everything Eventual. And then I think Low Men and the Yellow Coats was number 2. And then the Little Sisters of Eluria was my third favorite. Mostly because the Little Sisters of Eluria, it just felt like an extra chapter to the Dark Tower, you know?
Right, yeah, exactly.
Which is what's good about it too. Like, that's not a negative thing. That's its purpose. It feels like a side quest that Roland went on. But Everything's Eventual was really intriguing. Like, whenever I first started reading it, and I was reading this on the cruise ship actually, and I was telling Becca about it, and I was like, there is a lot going on in this story. So let me read the synopsis, and then we'll talk about some details that we picked out.
Yeah.
So Everything's Eventual. Richard Dinky Earnshaw, a 19-year-old high school dropout, explains that he got a good job in which he gets his own house, car, and virtually anything he asks for, including CDs that have not been released yet. He also gets a small weekly cash allowance, provided he doesn't look for the people who drop it through his mail slot, and that he gets rid of any money left over at the end of the week. He dumps his excess change into the gutter by his house, and he puts his bills in the garbage disposal. So before I read the rest, I want to point out there's a few other like kind of creepy things just in this setup. One is that there's a group of people that come in and clean the house while he's gone on like Thursday or something. And so he knows that every week he has to go to like watch 2 or 3 movies to give them time to clean the house.
Yeah.
And he suspects that they're on the same restrictions he is, because he notices that they don't clean the room he spends the most time in, because it seems like they're scared to go in there.
Right.
And then the thing with the CD that's not released yet, he has an items list on the refrigerator that if he writes anything on there, it'll get acknowledged in some way.
Right.
Like one time he asked for this exotic painting just to see if they could do it, and he got a print of it, like a nice print mounted and framed on the wall. And then the money thing is weird too.
That's
because
weird
it's like
too.
He has to start every week at 0. He can't accumulate money. And I think this is because the people that are watching him and in charge of all this, they don't want him to be able to save money and to like change his lifestyle. They want him to live this lifestyle and this lifestyle alone.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can't like store up money and then like somehow use it to escape or whatever. Not that
right, yeah.
Not that like
he's not even trying to escape.
That's what I'm saying. Not like he's trying to escape, but it won't put that idea in your head like, ooh, I could get away.
Or
I
could use a bigger money. I could have a bigger house, like I could have a nicer car. This way he's just happy with what he's got and he's just staying with where he's at. It is revealed that Dinky has the ability to mentally influence people by drawing complicated designs or pictures in a way that he does not completely understand. This is illustrated when he recalls that as a child, when a dog tormented him on his way home from school, he seemingly unknowingly drove it to suicide. At Dinky's previous job at a convenience store, he was forced to endure humiliating treatment by another employee named Skipper until the day Dinky used his power to make Skipper kill himself. Dinky is discovered by a man named Mr. Sharpton, who claims to work for an organization that searches across the world for people with such talents. Dinky is recruited to kill very specific targets by emailing them his designs that he creates on an Apple computer. He is in return given a life that seems ideal, complete with a house and other benefits. Mr. Sharpton tells Dinky that the people he is ordered to kill are wicked, horrible criminals, and that the world is better off without them. For a time, Dinky lives his new life in a semi-mindless bliss. However, when he finds an article in the newspaper about one of the individuals whom he has killed, a seemingly innocent old newspaper columnist, he begins to feel guilty of what he has done. After researching more into his other victims, Dinky realizes that the organization has been using him to assassinate political dissidents and alternative thinkers. As the story ends, Dinky plans his escape, but not before sending one final email to Mr. Sharpton, his recruiter, with a nondescript symbol attached. And I remember the last word of the story is Excalibur, because Mr. Sharpton had on his tie.
Yeah.
This was a really good short story. I liked it a lot. Outside of the Dark Tower and everything, this was a good story.
Right. So one thing I like about this story too is like the way the story is actually structured. Because at the very beginning, he's just like Dinky. Like, he's just this kind of loser kid, and you don't really know much about him.
Yeah.
He's a loser.
And it's told from his perspective, too.
Right. Yeah. And then, after a little bit, it kind of throws in these little, tidbits, and you slowly learn hints. That this kid isn't normal. Like, there's more to it. And, it just builds and builds until you find out, this dude's pretty powerful. He can do some crazy stuff. And he's a lot smarter.
Yeah.
I mean, his nickname's Dinky. So when you think Dinky, you think of a rube, a stupid redneck kind of thing. And he's far from it, very far from it. And
the narrative is in such a way that it's like you're speaking with Dinky. Dinky is telling the story. All the internal monologue is from the perspective of a teenage boy. I think he's 19 years old. It's the first line of our synopsis, 19-year-old high school dropout. And it's all told from that perspective. He's going to tell you about his cool car and his cool house first.
Right.
And it also is whenever you're speaking to somebody and as they talk more and more and more, they feel more comfortable. And so they let in a little bit more of the story, more and more, and what they might have been embarrassed about at the beginning. And yeah, so that leads to what you're describing, where it's a little drops along the way.
Kind of at the beginning, where it's talking about his home life, with his mom and all that stuff.
Yeah,
it's that's one Dinky, and then he sees this he realizes he's not going anywhere. That his life peaked at 19 or whatever age before he runs into them. And then he realizes what he is. And, it's kind of like the 15 minutes of fame. He gets that 15 minutes of fame with these people and he latches onto it, and he likes he questions sort of like the whole money thing. Like, he's kind of like, this is weird, whatever, but like he still does it. And, the same thing with the cleaning of the house. He's just like, okay, that's weird again, but hey, I've got a house. I'm getting this money. I got whatever I want. So I'm just going to kind of forget about any of those questions. And then, of course, eventually that stuff really starts digging in. But so the people that recruit him, now it doesn't specifically say anywhere in the story, but it's got to be Sombra Corporation.
Yeah, I don't know that
North Central Positronics. It's got to be one of them. I know
that in Low Men and the Yellowcoats they use the term breakers, but I can't remember if they do in this one or not.
No, in this one they don't really, but from.
But I'm guessing Dinky is a breaker, is what I'm guessing.
Yeah, from the Dark Tower story that the breakers are powerful psychics.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, kind of. I'm not really spoilery.
So my hypothesis, as somebody that hasn't read the last book, but read up to this point, and I guess to be fair, I've read the first part of the last book, even though I haven't read the rest. Right. My guess is that there's a company, and we've been hearing about Sombra Corporation and North Central Positronics, but there's a company going around and they're like an evil Xavier school for the gifted. They're going around finding all these mutants.
Yes.
And they're using them to break the beams of the tower. And that's the breakers. And I'm guessing that Dinky is somehow recruited into this. Now, the thing that is a gap in my mind, though, is how does Dinky go from living in this house and sort of assassinating people that Sombra wants him to assassinate and somehow also breaking the beams of the tower? Like, I don't understand how those two things connect yet, but I know that somehow that's going to be a thing. And especially in Low Men in the Yellow Coats, I mean, dude, basically, like, he says that he was a breaker and that he's escaped. Right. So, I mean, yeah, I'm guessing that Dinky is a similar thing to what he was. Are there any other...
I like, that he does realize that, he's still human. Like, when he finds out what he's doing, he's a good guy. So that kind of gives you an insight into his character as well. Like, and that'll, not really a spoiler either, but that will tie into his character. He has a conscience, and I'm sure deep down when he was doing it before he realized, he had to have known that, he knows he was killing people, but he still had to have known, like, deep down that even if these people weren't necessarily, like, they kind of made it seem like he's killing all these evil people, but still, like, you probably know that you're being manipulated in some way. You're just overlooking it.
Otherwise, why wouldn't they let you know? You'd be more enthusiastic about it if it was really terrible.
Like, hey, here's Mao Zedong. Let's assassinate this guy.
Yeah. I think that this is like, outside of the Dark Tower series, I find it interesting to think about, like, how almost any job you think about, you think about, like, I don't want to insult anybody that may be listening and what their occupation is, but there's jobs that you think, like, how could someone do that all day, Right. Like euthanizing pets, it's like, how could you do that? How could that be your job? And I realize that people that do that strive really hard to not have to do that. You know what I mean? Like, that's a bad example, but just whatever occupation you're in, you find ways to do cartwheels in your own mind to justify whatever it is. Oh. Like, I remember I'm not a vegetarian anymore, but I remember being a vegetarian working at Sonic. And it's like, how do I serve cheeseburgers all day and yet I don't eat them, Right. I need a job. I have to have a job. And they offered to pay me. So I'll do this. And one is like those debt collectors that are like fake. They pretend to be scammers. The FBI. Yeah. And they're essentially using scam tactics to collect on debt that has been turned over to collections. Like, every time I haven't gotten a call from them in years. Thank God I've cleaned up my credit. But there was a time period where I got calls from them all the time. And I would think that if I had that job, I would be like, hey, you owe this debt. Like, I would just be honest. Like, here's the situation. Yeah. You owe this debt, and we purchased it from the company for pennies on the dollar, and we want to collect at least some portion of it back. Like, let's make a deal before this hits your credit and ruins you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they'll be like, we're going to send an officer to your house. They're going to ruin your life. Your kids are going to be crying when you get carried off to jail. Like,
right.
It's like, you're straight up lying, Like, how do you do this job all day? And they have to have a job, and they have this one now. And so the immediate need is to pay rent or whatever it is. And so they go through these cartwheels and they say, the right thing to do is this in this moment, And I feel like Dinky's in that situation, I think if I were in Dinky's shoes when I was 19 and I was living this life, I guarantee you I would have never investigated. I would have just said, okay, who do you want me to send an email to? Okay, cool. I'm sure he was a terrible person. Let's next one.
It's not like you're not right up in front of them. Like, it's not like you're pointing a gun to their head and pulling a trigger. You're doing it through email.
Right.
Like, I mean,
yeah. And it's the perfect setup for this company because, especially when you're 19, almost any 19 would not be willing to do it if they saw the target. You know what I mean? Right. I feel confident to say that almost every 19-year-old would have enough of a conscience to not be willing to do it if they saw the target. But if it's completely invisible to them, almost every 19-year-old would just not ask questions. I can't imagine. I'm wrong about that. Maybe there's a lot more strong-willed 19-year-olds than I was at 19.
I like too, like, the king is obviously, like, I wouldn't say obsessed, but like, so you've got The Shining, which is a little boy that has psychic powers that, can do, like, send his thoughts across great distances and, can do great things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've got Jake who does it. You've got, there's Firestarter, but she can start, she's pyrotechnic. You've got Carrie who's telekinetic. There's a book that's really good called The Institute that's sort of like this, except for they kidnap kids with psychic abilities to do remote stuff. You've got, I know there's a few others that I can't, but like, this is like a big ongoing theme he has. Yeah. And there's usually, like, in most of these cases, there's a secret company behind the scenes that is doing all this stuff. It kind of tells you, like, number one, that, he's into psychic stuff. And also he's all into the secret government type stuff, too. Really cool. And,
corporation. I think a lot of his writing that we've read so far, even like The Long Walk, in a lot of ways, it's like anti-corporate and corporate greed and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I really like this story too. It's short, but puts a lot of stuff into short pages. And I like the ending where, he realizes what he's doing and how he's been manipulated. So he's like, well, I'm going to do it one more time.
Yeah, I really like the realization of, I know what he's really into. I know what'll mean something to him. Excalibur. And then also the tie-in to the Dark Tower because of the Knights of El and all that. That was really cool. I think that was like the last word of the story, and it ended like perfectly. Again, I think I was listening to the audiobook on the cruise, and I was just like, ooh, goosebumps. The end of the story. That was a really good one. Really good cruise ship read, too. Yeah, I did. Everything's Eventual and Low Men in Yellow Coats on the cruise.
Yeah, right. Everything's Eventual.
So at the end of, I don't remember if it was, I think it's Everything's Eventual. In the audiobook version that I had of it, at the end, there's like a reading from Stephen King. Have you heard this? And he's really funny. He does like a whole routine before the reading. And
I don't remember it.
He does this bit about like, and tonight, whenever you're getting in your car, there's no reason to check the back seat, but just saying that there's also no reason not to. And whenever you get home and you can't remember if the shower curtain was closed and he left it open, and now it's closed. There's no reason not to check. He was doing all these funny, like Stephen King stand-up routine. He's a pretty funny guy.
See if it was in the
all right,
book
so everything's... Yeah, let me see what it is in the audiobook. I'll tell you what the last story is.
I'll just do something. Now, in the book, it says, one day out of nowhere, I had a clear image of a young man pouring change into a sewer grating outside of a small suburban house in which he lived. I had nothing else, but the image was so clear and so disturbingly odd that I had to write a story about it.
Yeah.
Single hesitation, supporting my idea that stories are artifacts, not really made things which we create and can take credit for, but pre-existing objects we dig up. And that's how it starts.
I found it. It's LT's theory of pets.
Okay. That is...
See somebody there, would you? So, chat, what does it hurt?
That is actually... LT's is... So that is the story... I don't know if you can see it. But LT's theory of pets is this.
Yeah, in the audiobook version, they have a king is reading it.
Yeah. I like
he's doing shtick.
Sometimes he's a good narrator, sometimes he's not that good, but for short.
It was more funny listening to him talk before the story. All right, the longest short story, but for some reason has the shortest synopsis here, is Low Men in Yellow Coats. So I'll read the synopsis and then we'll talk about this one. So, Low Men in Yellow Coats. The story takes place in 1960 and revolves around a young boy, Bobby Garfield. He lives in Harwich, Connecticut with his mother, Liz, a widow. He comes to befriend a man named Ted Brodigan, who Bobby comes to find out possesses psychic abilities. Ted appears in some way connected to the Dark Tower and confesses to Bobby that he is being stalked by low men who work for the Crimson King. Although Bobby agrees to let Ted know when he starts seeing lost pet signs that indicate that the low are near, Bobby says nothing when he eventually starts seeing them for fear of losing his friend. So yeah, at the beginning of the story, he's not sure whether to trust what Ted is saying or not. It kind of seems like he might just be crazy, which what's interesting is having read The Dark Tower, you know that what he's saying all connects back to, he says things like all serve the beam and, you know, he talks about the Crimson King and all that. So he's like obviously talking about this other world that we're aware of, but young Bobby just thinks he sounds like a crazy old man. So one day, Bobby discovers his friend Carol has been beaten by 3 bullies with a baseball bat and left in a grove of trees. He takes her to his apartment where Ted has to remove her shirt in order to set her dislocated shoulder. Liz comes home, herself having just been violently raped at a real estate seminar. Wow, they really yada-yada'd a lot there. Yeah, there's a whole side plot with his mom and how she goes off with these men to this real estate seminar. And she misunderstands the situation. Thinking that Ted has been molesting Carol, she eventually calms down and takes Carol home while Ted decides to leave. Bobby realizes his mother has seen the Lost Pets posters. Suspecting that his mother has told the low men of Ted's whereabouts, Bobby catches up to Ted, who has gone to Bridgeport to collect his money from a bet he made there. The low men are indeed there too and have captured Ted. Bobby is given the choice to go with Ted wherever that may be, but decides to stay, though he despises himself for his choice. After leaving Harwich with his mother and twice being put in juvenile detention facility, Bobby receives an envelope from Ted filled with red rose, the ones which surround the Dark Tower. He knows that Ted is once again free of the low men. So that's the synopsis of Low Men in Yellow Coats. I really like this story a lot.
I do too. So the one thing, like, so I had to double check while you're reading. So, like, this is another one of those stories that I like because it starts out where, you know, it's just a weird older guy that's living upstairs, and he seems like a pretty cool dude. And then stuff gets sprinkled in more, like, you know, stuff that sounds very strange, like, hey, look, you know, look for hopscotch, you know, games and chalk with moons and stars
and moons,
and then look for lost pet posters. And so I wanted to double check. So Hearts in Atlantis, the novel, came out September 14th, 1999. Wolves of the came out November 1st, 2003. So when you first read Hearts in Atlantis, like the hopscotch things, the lost pet things and all that stuff would have been like just really weird. You know, you'd be like, that's weird. But then when Wolves of the Calla come out and you start getting Callahan's backstory and mentioning like the moons and stars and the lost pet posters, you know, that's just kind of one of those cool things. You're like, like, and
that
so
is interesting.
I want to remember which one came first. So yeah, it was definitely Hearts in Atlantis came in, which is also really interesting because it's kind of like a, you know, like a foreshadowing of Callahan's story that comes out like 4 years later. This book would have been, so it was released September 14th, 99. He was in the accident on June 19th, 1999. So obviously this was written before his accident. And we know that the accident and King himself, you know, again, for people, spoilers, that King plays a role in the Dark Tower series as a whole. So again, it makes me wonder, like, when he's writing Hearts in Atlantis in, you know, 98 or whenever he really began writing it, was it meant, did he already have that story in mind? Like that it was going to tie into Callahan and that it was going to be him in the story and stuff? Or did he write this and think, you know, this is kind of a cool, like, Dark Tower adjacent thing? Then he gets in the accident and then he comes back and he's like, oh, I can pull this even more together and I'm in it now too. Like, I always wonder, I mean, obviously, you know, the accident affected him and his writing a lot. But I always wonder how far in advance, because, you know, he always says when he's writing, it's like a natural thing. He doesn't like it just occurs. And like, I don't know how it's going to end or I don't know where it's going. Like, but like how much of that, like, was like a precog, like this is where I where I want to go, so, and all that's really interesting to me. Like that's why I love these books so much too. Is like is that kind of stuff.
I agree, and I like thinking about that. So the Dark Tower stuff. Whenever Ted is talking about all follow the beam, all serve the beam, and he talks about the Dark Tower and. I don't remember if he mentions the roses around the Dark Tower, but he mentions a lot of stuff related to the books that were written up to 1998. So obviously Stephen King pulled that from those books. He must have already been thinking about the Low Men, but was he thinking about that as just an interesting thing that he could incorporate in his books? Or was he thinking about it in the sense of, well, he must have, because he said that they served the Crimson King. He must have been piecing this part of the story together. So, you know, I wonder what, had he have not gotten hit by a van,
how the story would have changed.
Hit by a van, how the story would have changed. Yeah. Would it have been similar and what would have changed? Yeah.
Right.
That's really interesting to think about.
Like I said, when he mentions the moons and stars and that, was he thinking ahead to... this is going to be the same thing like with the Low Men searching for Callahan? Or did he even at that point when he wrote this book, did he even know that Callahan was going to be a character in the Dark Tower series yet? Like all that's, I really like that. And to me, if I had guessed, I don't think he knew at the time of this writing that Callahan was going to be a character.
Callahan? I don't think so.
I think that just naturally occurred. Like, he's writing and all of a sudden, Callahan should be in this kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think that here's the way I think it could have happened. Okay. My fan fiction on this. It could have been all stemming from he got the idea that Roland and Eddie should go on the pursuit of trying to save him from getting hit by the van and dying. And then he said, okay, well, that means that characters from my stories are going to enter my world. What other characters could I use besides Roland and Eddie? And that could have been what led him down the path, not completely fleshed out, but just the idea that like I want characters to have to come and somehow interact with the real world and with my real life. And then he started thinking about what characters would be good to do that with. And then my suspicion, I know that somehow Dinky and Ted and maybe even Bobby are going to somehow work into the Dark Tower. And so in a way, he's writing these as setups for characters that could come up in future Dark Tower stories.
Right.
I mean, I don't know for sure, obviously, but...
obviously with Ted, like, from reading the story that it's Dark Tower. If I wouldn't have... We should read everything because it's Dark Tower related. If you just read that story, you would have no idea that it had anything to do with the Dark Tower.
No, I don't think so. So the guy... We didn't talk about this when we talked about Everything's Eventual, but the guy that recruits him, Mr. Sharpton.
Mr. Sharpton.
He reminds me of the main vampire dude, Sayer. His name's Sayer. He reminds me of him.
He's the guy.
Yeah, it reminds me of Sayer, but they're not the same character.
And that's why
I think that we could have read that short story years ago before we ever read The Gunslinger.
Right, and that's
and
why
I would have enjoyed it just as much.
So he puts that story in this book along with Little Sisters of Eluria, which is definitely Dark Tower. And I said, like when he wrote Everything's Eventual, I don't think at that point that Dinky had in his mind had anything to do with Dark Tower.
Really? Okay.
I think it was just a good story.
But if
once he came up with the ideas of breakers, he's like, "Oh yeah, I've got Dinky. He was a psychic. Yeah. Maybe I could fit him in as a breaker or whatever." Whereas Ted,
he writes his stories the way a dungeon master puts together a campaign. Like, oh, I've introduced the players to that character. I could use that character in this spot just to bring. That's the way he writes. Like he assumes his readers have read everything he's written, and then he's like, "Oh, I'll reintroduce him to that character from that one book." Yeah. But I want to give him this. So you're probably right. You're probably absolutely on the nose. It probably was not connected to Dark Tower until he, in the future, decided it should be. But if you think about it, it would be some next level 3-dimensional chess if he did know Dinky was going to be a part of the Dark Tower, and he intentionally put it in a book next to a short story related to Roland in the Dark Tower because he knew that Dark Tower fans would read those short stories. That's some next level chess gaming there.
So with this story, you find out that Ted has basically escaped from somewhere, and he's on the run, and he's like, he even eventually says he's like the main guy. He's like, as far as like the people, he's like very important, and that's why these people are looking for him so hard and stuff like that. And like he's a very powerful psychic. And one of the things that's interesting too is that he basically transfers or gives that ability to Bobby, even though it's for a relatively short time, but that Ted is so powerful in his abilities that he's able to actually infer those abilities onto other people, and Bobby's able to like do the 3 and win every hand because he knows like everything. The guy gets pissed off about it, and that's really cool too. Like who is this guy? Like he's like a psychic, but now he's like super.
Yeah.
Because I've never, in all the stories, not in just King, but like in most stories about like people that have, telekinetic or psychokinetic or any of those abilities, you don't really hear them, transferring, being able to do something like that.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting concept too, that,
I could see how that could be used in the plot. Some things popped in my head, but
I think he mentions that he's like a facilitator. I think he tells Bobby that at one point.
What I'm thinking about is if he were at the point of the story that we're at now with Roland and the quartet, if he were in the Dark Tower and trying to escape, then he could, if he's, depending on how strong he is, he could possibly give Jake the ability to use his powers to be able to see where he's at to come save him. But I'm just thinking of, crazy scenarios that might happen that probably won't happen. I don't even know if he's in the Dark Tower. But
no, I was going to say,
I got some non-Dark Tower related points to make.
Right.
So for one thing, non-Dark Tower related, if you just read this story and he's talking about all this nonsense about the tower and all that, and you've never read any of the Dark Tower, then you would say, oh, he's just sounds like a crazy old man. And maybe what he's saying is true, but it's not consequential to this story. It just sounds like nonsense. But to someone that has read the Dark Tower, it sounds familiar. But one thing I wanted to point out, this was like the most clever thing. It happens in the beginning of the book, but then it kind of veers off in a different direction. But the beginning of Low Men in Yellow Coats feels like a story, where there's like a young kid that's the main character. The parents don't ever listen to him. Somebody new rolls into the neighborhood and is suspicious in some way. And he's like kind of spying on them and trying to figure out what's going on. And the story kind of plays out as the mystery of this, like, kind of creepy old man in the neighborhood. That's a common thing. It's in Home Alone. Like, it's a common thing that's done in a lot of movies and stories.
Right.
Only I felt like this one kind of turned it on its ear, because while the kid is focused on Ted and how strange Ted is, there's this whole subplot with the mother going on that as the reader you pick up on, but because it's told from the perspective of Bobby doesn't see these things about his mother because it's his mother and he just doesn't see her that way. But you start to pick up on how her lipstick is smeared when she comes home from work, her slip is showing, and she seems tired all the time, and like, you kind of pick up on there's something going on with the mom. I at first thought she was on some kind of drugs or something that Bobby just didn't know about. But I thought it was a really clever way of writing that story, where this is a story of trying to solve the mystery of some strange person in the neighborhood, only it's not Ted. It's Liz that is the strange person in the neighborhood. That's the mystery, not Ted. And all along, Bobby is like trying to spy on Ted. And it turns out like we're really following, as the reader, we're following the story of Liz. I thought that was a really clever way that was written. The
interesting thing about Liz, too, is Bobby loves his mother, but he doesn't like her very much. And I think those feelings.
I can relate to that, baby.
It feeds into those things where, like, there are all these clues that there's something really bad going on with his mother, but he because the fact that he doesn't like her, he kind of ignores them, maybe even subconsciously or whatever, but like,
I think he's ignoring them because he can't, because she's the victim of something. But at the beginning of the story, you don't know that. And you think, oh, what if she might be a drug dealer? Like, I don't know what's going on.
Right.
But Bobby can't see it because he just doesn't see the bad in her. He only sees the good in her. You know what I mean? But by the end of the story, you find out that she's a victim of, like, her boss is taking advantage of her.
It's that she doesn't like Ted because she's just a bitch. He even has that thought where, like, he even thinks that word, that she's a bitch. And
but she's probably just not trusting of men.
It's because she hates men because she's been, like, abused by him. And, like, she treated her husband before the death like crap.
Yeah.
And Bobby caught that too. And like, he's too young to understand, a lot of these clues too, like that his mom's being abused, but like,
yeah, definitely.
It's a really interesting dynamic between the two of those because she, again, like during parts of the story, you think that she just doesn't like him either, but you kind of get it.
That's why I kept thinking
that she really does. She loves him, but it's just in her own way. She sees the dad.
They're both stuck in.
Yeah, she holds a grudge. Her husband
against the dad, but so that's something else that I won't say I can relate to. My mom was always really honest about my dad and his pros. My mom, neither parent has like cut down the other, but I can kind of relate to the idea of like hearing about who his father was whenever he was growing up, but then whenever he met people that actually knew his father and they said, "Oh, where did you hear that?" Like, like he seemed to be a completely different person than what his mother described him as. And I don't know, just there's a lot of insights in these stories that I just don't see unless Stephen King has lived like 100 lives. Like I don't see how he pulls all these different insights that seem so, so like on the nose, like so spot on.
As far as him personally, his dad left when he was an infant, I believe. He was really young.
Yeah.
And so in a way, I don't know what his dynamic with his mom was, but you almost get that dynamic. Maybe that's kind of like what he was going through, that like his own mom saw him, like her husband that left, in like a weird dynamic, growing up too, where she loved him, but he reminded her too much of him.
Yeah. I wonder if the story from Song of Susanna, where he talks about cutting the wood in the woodshed and the spiders on the chickens and all that, I wonder if that really came from his life.
Well, I'll tell you a really good book that you should read. It's kind of something on your free time, but his book called On Writing. And it's a nonfiction book.
You've talked about that a lot.
He just talks about his writing thing. And there's a story where he talks about going to a barn. I think it was, I can't remember specifically. It was like maybe a dead animal, but there were spiders everywhere. And it really freaked him out when he was young. And that's why spiders are like a recurring theme in a lot of his stories.
Yeah.
And so, definitely like that's molded him.
Because that's based... In Song of Susanna, that's exactly what happens. It's like chickens, and he sees the little red spiders on them, and he's scared they're going to get on him and give him the disease.
Yes.
So for him to have two different versions of that story, something must have happened. Yeah.
At the same time, Bobby has gone through his life kind of, being on his own. He's young and he cooks his own meals and he does all this on his own, and he's never had this male figure. And then all of a sudden, Ted comes along and he's like dad replacement. And even though Ted tells him how important these things are to look out for, at first, just like anybody would, hopscotch things and pets, stuff. But then he actually sees it. And then internally he talks, and then once he finally realizes that maybe it's even more than just coincidence, he's more afraid of losing Ted and that father figure than what may happen if he doesn't say it.
Yeah.
And of course that leads to the end where, it's basically Ted has to make the decision like, to protect Bobby, I have to go with these people, and eventually, lets himself be caught at the very end to make sure Bobby is safe.
Yeah,
and it's weird. Like the one thing I was kind of like, it's not that I don't like. It's just that, and it's also great because it's not every story is happy ending type thing. Like. You really like Bobby as a kid, and then you find out later in life he's like a criminal and like all this stuff, and 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 it obviously has to do with this, like not having the male figure and the way his mom treats him and all this stuff. And then but then at the very end, you're given hope with the letter that like maybe that's something that changes his life and turns his life around, and like, you know, he changes who he is as a person, you know, after that. You know, it kind of gives you like a bad ending, but a feel good little snippet there at the end. And like I really like the story. I like the low men. It's like one of the first times that, you know, obviously you get what the low men are, like kind of like the police force of the Crimson.
I like how the gangster kids describe them. They're like, they walk, but they don't quite touch the ground. Like they're pretending to walk, but really they're floating. And their cars don't quite move right.
It's like they're alive.
I like all of that.
Yeah.
So how different is the book to the movie?
So I remember watching the movie a while ago. Because, you know, the book, I mean, the movie's called Hearts in Atlantis, not Low Men in Yellow Coats.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure they take out all references to the Dark Towers. And, you know, he does have, Ted has like the psychic ability stuff, but it's not like, you know, he's not a breaker. I can't remember. He was doing something for the government from what I remember. And like basically he escapes like the CIA type thing.
And were the low men like low men, or were they more like G men?
G men.
Yeah. Okay.
From what I remember, it was a really good movie. But, you know, it's just they had to change it because of all the references to the Dark Tower.
Yeah. So the only other thing I can think of that I remember thinking when reading this book, I thought in the scene where he is fixing Carol's arm and her shirt's been cut off, and then Liz walks in and she like hits him in the head with a lamp. I really thought that the way this story is going to end is Lid's going to kill Ted before he can prove anything. Like she's just going to not know what's going on and kill Ted. And then also Carol was picking up, because she got touched by the psychic ability from Ted. She was picking up on what happened to Liz. And I thought, oh God, she's going to mistake those for her memories. And she's going to say that's what Ted did to her. And nobody's going to believe Bobby whenever, you know, he says that's not what's happening. I thought that's the way the book was going to end, and I was like, oh my God, I don't want this. I don't want this to happen to these characters. And
there's
but yeah, she nearly killed him.
So the other stories in that book, Hearts in Atlantis, and then oh God, I can't remember what the other story is called, but one story is about Carol. And then another story is about
that's interesting.
Sully John.
We didn't even talk about Sully John. He was the Skeeter to Bobby's Doug.
Exactly.
And Carol was Patty Mayonnaise.
There you go.
Ted was Mr. McGruff next door.
That whole dimension too with them, like, you know, he and Sully are from like different lifestyles, and this is that age where those things start to matter, which is very interesting. He goes off to camp with the other like kids that are more well-to-do, and he gets to experience all these things, whereas like, you know, Bobby's stuck. You know, his big thing is, you know, he gets a library card, and you know, that's like the height of thing, which is also interesting because there's a character in it, Ben Hanscom, who he's basically that way. His mom gives him an adult library card for his birthday, and you can tell that like
that was Bobby's.
Yeah, that was Bobby's thing, and like obviously
Bobby's was an adult library card
with King. Like that was a big step, probably when he was a kid. Like, you know, growing up, he, you know, because obviously he was a big reader when he was young. You know, getting that first adult library card was a huge milestone, and it's obviously bled through a lot of his stories. and characters. So yeah, another little interesting tidbit. Obviously, lots of foreshadowing maybe to come for stuff. They've mentioned in Wolves of Kala that, there's another group of like Cantoy and the other people, the people with the bird heads.
I thought those were the Cantoy.
They're Cantoy, and there's like another so when Bobby goes to the Dogan and listens to
when Jake goes to the Dogan.
Yeah, when Jake goes to the Dogan and listens to the conversation between Andy and Ben Slightman, and then somebody else somewhere, and he finds out the name of this place, time, but this is this is all this building stuff that's all coming to a head in this last book. It's really exciting that you're getting ready to get into, because like you said, this first part is basically getting the quartet back together, and then then something is getting ready to happen. Obviously, the ultimate goal is to get to the Dark Tower, and to keep the Sombra and North Central Positronics from destroying the tower.
I don't know how that's all going to work out either. We'll talk about it more whenever we need to do an episode on what we've read so far. There's a lot to talk about there.
I would say I need to look at the book. You're aware you're in the second.
Let's see where I'm at.
Because I was going to look.
Yeah, I'm in the second chapter.
I'm going to look ahead, and I'll tell you a good place where we can stop and talk. And we'll both get to that point, and we'll do an episode. And maybe, in the meantime, for all of our listeners that have been...
They are parts. I'm on part 2.
Okay, so you're at Blue Heaven. Have you started Blue Heaven yet?
Yep.
Or
I've read part? Like 2... What did everything go off?
Hey!
My wife's cutting off the lights. She's
So
probably putting Elliot to bed.
I don't know how long that section is, but I would say if we can get through Blue Heaven and stop, don't look ahead and get anything. I'll look and see how long that part is. But that's a really good part for us to stop and talk after. Let you know, and we'll plan on that. And then if it's longer, we can always do the Brandon Sanderson episode with the new book chapter and prologue.
That's what I was going to say. It does look like it is longer, by the way. The first section that we've already read is 133 pages. It looks like this one is about, it goes from 141 to 300 would be 150 pages. It looks like it's about 250 pages.
Good.
It's a little bit longer.
I'll double check, see where it ends to.
We can still do it though.
Yeah,
because we got to do because we do need to do the Stormlight Archive stuff. So the good thing about it is it's going to come out in chunks. So it won't be like we can't possibly read it all week. We have to read what's been released and we got to wait.
Right.
But at the rate that I've been reading, that's still going to slow me down because I've been reading. I read a lot of this because I went to visit family in Texas and I didn't have anything to do but read. So I read the first 200 pages in a week. But then since then, I've probably read 25 pages. So that'll be the next 2 episodes we got coming up is our touch point on the Dark Tower. Thanks for listening. And we'll see you next week.
Peace out, everyone.